So the United States enters the war. And really what that meant was we walked into something that we were totally unprepared for. First of all, the size of our army. We had about 210,000 men. That sounds like a lot when you consider there were battles that had over 1 million men on each side. We were terribly unprepared to even be a small part of a battle. Our guns and weapons were badly outdated. They were great to fight a war 20, 25 years earlier. They were nothing compared to the modern machine guns that we saw from the French, British, and German armies. Even our Air Force, so to speak, wouldn't even be a great airline. We had 55 airplanes and only about 130 pilots. So what's the solution? First of all, to build an army. And people volunteered. In other words, they chose to join the armed forces. And we saw recruiting posters like you see here trying to convince people to do just that. In fact, we got about 500,000 men to volunteer to do military service. That being said, though, 500,000 isn't even a drop in the bucket. So we needed a draft. So we passed what's called the Selective Service Act. Selective Service Act required any man 21 to 30 years old to register for the draft. What happened then was each man would have a number. If your number was drawn, you would go out to war. The Selective Service Act was tremendously effective in raising an army. We drafted somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 to 300,000 men a month. So before real long, our 200,000 man army grew up into the high hundreds of thousands, and then eventually into the low millions, before in the end, we had roughly 3 million draftees. Of those 3 million draftees, we saw about 2.5 million go to Europe, and about 1.5 to 2 million actually in combat. Here's some American soldiers waiting to go out to the front lines, and they were called the Doughboys. They got that nickname because of the color of their belts, which looked kind of like unbaked bread dough. The American Doughboys were very enthusiastic. They couldn't wait to get out to battle, and they were also wildly ineffective since they had no idea what they were doing. Once the Americans are properly trained and learn the realities of war, the Americans will contribute greatly to the effort. Now, as we're building the Army, we have other concerns, such as how are we going to supply the Army? How are we going to feed them? How are we going to get all that stuff there? So we'll see adjustments throughout American life, areas like industry, the economy. People put up with rationing or limiting the goods that they can have. They'll be asked to buy bonds. They'll be asked to contribute to various war drives. In industry, we largely saw America's industrial captains cooperate with the government. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, many of these men were very patriotic and wanted to help the cause. Secondly, they saw that there could be a great profit to be made in the war, even though the government took steps to limit its war-related expenses. Finally, there was a fear of nationalization of industry. In other words, if industry didn't go along, the government would simply come and take it over. In that case, we would get no profit. So the industrial leaders were motivated in that way as well. Price controls came into place on several things. We actually had price controls on rail transport, since that's how we moved things. We asked people to not have their lights on certain days and at night. We asked people to not use their natural gas. Gasoline was rationed. We even went so far as to institute daylight savings time, where we put the clocks forward an hour. What that does, it makes sunset an hour later, so that'd be an hour less electricity we'd have to use, and hours more worth of coal every day that we could send over to the war effort. In terms of industries, first of all, shipbuilding. Shipbuilding and shipping became very, very important simply because the United States really didn't have a fleet. We had to build one. We had to do it fast. If there was any country in the world that could do it, it was the United States. And we saw a great deal of effort going into promoting shipbuilding, as you see from some of the posters here in front of you. This one in particular shows a rather masculine guy working in the shipyard. Part of the reason for that would be to sort of make shipbuilding almost on par with being in the armed forces. Even the tools he's using here have sort of a weapon-like look to them. And that all would have been on purpose. We desperately needed these ships. In terms of the economy, if you work in a war-related job, your wages went up somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% per year. So let's say I make $100 a month, suddenly it's $120 a month. That's going to be a huge increase for me. If you did not work on the war effort, your wage fell on an average of 35% per year. So there's a great financial incentive to work for the war if you weren't fighting. For unions, the government decided to partner with the unions and give them the okay, rather than fight with them. And that was probably a wise choice, as a strike would be the last thing that we would want in terms of production for the war. It would be a disaster. The only real prohibition put on the unions was one on striking. Many industrial jobs were actually exempted from the draft. In other words, you didn't have to go. The government put out a policy called work or fight. So if you went on strike, you lost your draft protection, your draft exemption, and you'd have to go live in a trench. For a lot of people, whatever your job was better than being at the front lines. Food. I'm sure you've all heard the phrase, enough food to feed an army. The United States actually needed enough food to feed an army. We had to condition people on how to eat. And tasked with doing this was the Food Administration, run by future President Herbert Hoover. The Food Administration did do some rationing, although really it tried to voluntarily get people to change their habits. So we saw various propaganda as we see here. The poster on the left, do with less so they'll have enough, appealing to people's sense of duty. Take a look at the one on the right, sort of tips for eating in the new world as it's been shaped by the war. And of course, the biggest thing, don't waste food. We see some other examples here. On the left, we have a woman amongst the frontline men. And remember during this time period that women would be in charge of the household meals. Okay, where the men march with rifles, she marches with a basket of food. Food is ammunition. Prices, so that people wouldn't get upset because the Food Administration did manipulate food prices. We have a notice for stores, kind of take the heat off of them. These are the fair prices listed by the government. The store had no control over that. Here's a look at rations for one person per 1 week. So we have in there probably in the neighborhood of about a pound of red meat, an egg, about a pound or so of cheese, and it looks like maybe a half a pound there or a half a pat of butter. You would have to make do with that for the entire week. So if you went ahead and ate all that right away, you were out of luck for the rest of the week. Most people pretty well just accepted these things as sort of the cost of defending the country. We saw again, if people weren't accepting, on the left we have a great reminder not to complain. You are fortunate compared to the people in Europe. On the right, we had an appeal to eat more cottage cheese so meat could be sent to the front. So the poster here extols the health values of cottage cheese. And then at the bottom says, we'll send you recipes for using this in place of meat. And oh, by the way, it's cheaper. Okay, arguing on a lot of different levels there. For violators, we saw sort of a peer pressure approach. This would be placed on people's homes. They were caught violating the rations or trying to somehow get around the Food Administration regulations. Remember that almost everybody knew someone in the war. So putting this up was like putting up a sign that said, you know, I really don't care about our soldiers, who just happen to be your father, your brother, your husband, your son, whatever. For businesses, we see a similar notice right here. Public notice closed because we violated the Food Administration guidelines. So we had a sort of a peer pressure approach to enforcing this versus a rigid law and order kind of thing. The government also had to pay for the war. And the way they chose to do that was through bonds. The reason they chose bonds was that it was people voluntarily giving their money over versus a tax, which could have proved to be very unpopular and maybe even impossible for some people to pay. Bonds work very simply. You give the government an amount of money right now, they give you more back later. They're actually quite a good investment if you happen to have the money lying around. We saw a great deal of effort go into trying to convince people to purchase bonds. And generally, that effort coincided with buying a bond the same thing as military action. We see bonds on the left as ammunition in a machine gun. We see bonds on the right as a way to stamp out the tiny little Kaiser. Or right here, we see bonds as the ability to strike now. What great vivid language in that poster. Buying bonds would be the same as taking out an enemy soldier. We also had to sell the war to the people. We chose to enter World War I. We did not have to go. So we saw a lot of different forms of propaganda or ways of getting people to think a certain way. One of the most effective were called the 4-Minute Men. The 4-Minute Men were trained to give what appeared to be a spontaneous defense of the war at any public place. At work, at church, on street corners, on public transportation. Wherever they heard talk of the war, their job was to jump up and give a defense of the war. There were roughly 75,000 4-Minute Men who gave an estimated 7.5 million speeches. We saw lectures as a form of propaganda. So we got to meet real live war heroes and tap into sort of that old theme of war as a romantic, heroic enterprise. We saw expositions. You'll notice at the bottom it says how the mighty have fallen. You could go to the park, pay a couple of bucks, and have the war come to you, or at least sort of a Disney-fied version of the war. And of course, what you would always see in the end is, we're good and we're winning. Movies got into the act. So you would go to the theater and see various war films. The Germans would always be cowardly. The Germans would always be sneaky, underhanded, and evil. And most importantly, the Germans would always be losing. This is really the first concentrated propaganda campaign in American history. And it worked to great effect, as there was actually very, very little opposition to the war. Just in case that wasn't enough, we actually made these opposition to the war illegal during World War I. 2 laws, the Espionage and Sedition Acts, made it illegal to speak against the war, to speak against the draft, to interrupt the draft, or to print anything that had those same aims. If you did that, you could be punished by up to 10 years in jail, or if you had a newspaper, you could actually lose the rights to mail your newspaper. About 6,000 people were arrested for violating these laws, although their convictions were later overturned, as these are clear violations of the U.S. Constitution and our right to free speech. Nobody spoke up at the time, though, because they were afraid of being seen as an unpatriotic or anti-war American. So 3 things to remember. Number 1, the United States had to create an army and war supplies essentially from nothing. Secondly, the United States government required civilians to make many sacrifices at home. And finally, propaganda made its first wide-scale appearance in the United States during World War I. That's all for now. We'll see you next time.